Now.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. We are continuing on with our series on return. This is Return Ministries. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? This is actually the sixth in our series, and we're still talking about the Exodus. We've been talking about the Exodus for actually the last 2 weeks, and we're continuing on with this story because the Exodus, in a way, is the paradigm for return. And I'm going to show some features of the Exodus, I think, that connect to a pattern that we see going forward. Obviously, there are some things about the Exodus that are unique. Last week, we focused on the Exodus and God's promise to the children of Israel, and as it relates to the covenant he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and what God did for the Jewish people when he brought them out of bondage and made them his own. But that's only one side of the coin, actually, with respect to what the Exodus accomplished, because on the other side of the coin is how the Exodus has an impact on the nations. And Aliyah and the return of the Jewish people is not just a story or a move of God or the purposes of God only for Israel and the Jewish people, but also for the nations. Even in the last day scenario, this is still very much when God is at work in Israel, he's also at the same time accomplishing something in the nations. And both of these principles, both of these themes, and both of these purposes are interconnected. I think that's really the big message we want to get out, is that, you know, some people have an interest in the Jewish people for whatever reason and what God's doing with the return of the Jewish people to the land. And some people say, well, that's fine, but that's not my interest. I'm into something else that God's doing. But I think actually to break things up like that is maybe not seeing the big picture, because you can't really separate what God is doing in the nations from what God is doing in Israel and among the Jewish people. They're related, and as followers of Yeshua, both of these dual mandates are important to us because they're important to the heart of God. So you'll hear me talk a lot about this. And of course, last year we did a 12-part series on One New Man, really stressing that. We're not so much stressing One New Man here, but you can't help but see one new man in the return. So we're going to look at the Exodus as it relates to the nations of the world in this series. It's particularly Egypt, but not only Egypt. And all right, so I want to go back to Genesis 15. We've been using Genesis 15 sort of as our controlling scripture because it's the prophetic word to Abraham of what is going to take place when he promises Abraham that his descendants would inherit the land. So I'm going to share my screen and go back to that scripture. Here we are. Just let me move me out of the way here a bit. Okay. Then the Lord said to Avram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they'll be afflicted for 400 years, but I'll bring judgment on the nation that they serve. And afterward you shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, you shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. All right. So this is the promise. I will give this land to your descendants, but there's going to be a gap. Well, they will be in servitude for 400 years. Now, we talked last time a little bit about the sin of the Amorites, not yet complete. And so we're not going to touch on that aspect, but you see in the midst of this explanation to Abraham, he says, I'm going to punish the nation that holds them in bondage, and then they will come out with great possessions. And you have to wonder why that is inserted in there. That seems like maybe not the most important detail, but actually I think we need to appreciate that when God highlights material possessions, there's a important spiritual principle and a spiritual purpose here. So we're going to start there with this promise to Abraham that the ones that are enslaved for 400 years will be released and will come out with great possessions. And you might ask, why is that? Maybe you could see it as compensation for 400 years of slavery. I think that's perhaps fair to see it that way, but there's more to it than that. But let's go back to the scriptures, and we're going to now go into Exodus. When they're leaving Egypt, we read this. The people of Israel, excuse me, had also done as Moses told them, for they asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus, they plundered the Egyptians, and they're thus fulfilling what God told Abraham in Genesis 15. So why? Why did they do this? Yes, you could look at it as compensation, but there's another very important dimension to this. That is, once they're in the wilderness, God says to the people of Israel, build me a sanctuary that I may dwell among you. That's Exodus 25, verse 8. And very, very key, important scripture for us, because the whole point of taking this people to himself is that he might be their God, that he might dwell in their midst. And in order for the maker of heaven and earth to actually dwell in the midst of Israel, they had to build a sanctuary, a dwelling place, a place where God actually could meet with the people. His physical manifestation of his presence was in the camp of Israel and continued on with them. And in order to do that, there were very specific instructions about what had to be built. And it was according to a divinely inspired pattern. And Moses is warned several times by the Lord, see to it. Oh, sorry about that. See to it that you build according to the pattern. And what did they need to build this sanctuary? They needed lots of silver and lots of gold. Now, this is the thing. The plundering of the Egyptians is not so much to obtain personal wealth or even compensation for slavery. The plundering of the Egyptians and the receiving of all this wealth, the silver and gold, is so that they could build a sanctuary, build a tabernacle, build a place for the presence of God to be among them. And very interesting, we see the same pattern repeated. I'm going to show you a number of times. So that's what the plundering of the Egyptians was about. And here we read in 1 Kings, Hiram sent to Solomon saying, I have heard the messages that you've sent to me. I am ready to do all you desire in the matter of cedar and cypress timber. So Hiram supplied Solomon with all the timber of cedar and cypresses that he desired. So what's this about? We talk about Solomon building the temple, but accurately, it's Solomon and Hiram who build the temple. Isn't that amazing? Again, according to a pattern that David received, a heavenly pattern that required immense material wealth to construct. But we see that Hiram, who was king in Sidon, Lebanon, he supplies the building materials for the temple, just like the Egyptians supplied the building materials for the tabernacle, to build the place where the presence of God was in the midst of Israel. It is a Israeli and international cooperation, and it is those from the nations who are supplying the material goods. Let's go back and I'll show you again the same pattern with the second temple. So this is after, and we're going to talk a lot about Israel returning from Babylon in the days of Nehemiah and Ezra and Zerubbabel. That's down the road. But just a foretaste here. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. All who were about then aided them, that is, the returning exiles, with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, with beasts, with costly wares, besides all that was freely offered. And Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem. So you see here, the Egyptians supply the material goods for the tabernacle. Hiram supplies the material goods for Solomon's temple. And Cyrus supplies pretty well almost all the building materials for the temple that Zerubbabel and those first returning exiles built. That's a very clear pattern in Scripture. And I want us to really appreciate what this pattern tells us, because it's saying that in order for the presence of God to be manifest on the earth, it requires Israel and the nations together. Isn't that a beautiful, beautiful picture of one new man? That the people of God, as they were as it was only Israel in those days, were not able to actually truly be the people of God without the participation of the nations among them. And the nations have this very key role to supply material goods. And you see how even in the New Testament scriptures, this pattern continues. When there's a famine throughout the whole Roman Empire, right? Agabus goes down to Antioch, predicts there's going to be a famine that's going to hit the whole Roman world. And what do the believers in Antioch remember? That just before this prophetic word, we read about how many Gentiles are coming to the Lord in Antioch. And they decide to gather their resources, kind of like Joseph did, knowing there was a famine to come, but not for themselves. Then they send the resources, the money they collect, with Paul and Barnabas to give to the saints in Jerusalem. They don't They don't distribute it to all the believers all over the world. It goes directly to Jerusalem. Gentiles supplying material goods back to Jerusalem, just like the Egyptians, Hiram, and Cyrus. And of course, what did Paul do? He collected material goods from all the churches in the diaspora among the nations to bring back to the saints in Jerusalem. And he even tells the Roman church in chapter 15, verses 25 to 27, that they have an obligation to provide material goods to the Jewish people. You can read that in Romans 15, 25 to 27, but Paul is connecting back to this pattern that is first established in Genesis, actually, and prophesied in Genesis 15, and we see really carried out and in the Exodus, and the pattern continues, and it continues to this day. So the presence of God, the manifestation of the presence of God, is a partnership between Israel and the nations. And we see this reflected in the Exodus, and that's a very important thing. All right, so, but there's more to it here than just supplying material goods. There's other dimensions of this connection to the nations as well. So let's move on. So when Moses and Aaron come before Pharaoh, they say, "Thus says the Lord, Yud He Vav He." We've talked about the name last time. "The God of Israel, let my people go that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go?" Ay, 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 ay. What a thing to say. "I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." You hear it in Pharaoh's voice, like, who is the Lord? Okay, so you have to understand Pharaoh's mindset. Pharaoh is a god. The God of the Hebrews is the God of Pharaoh's slaves. I mean, you know, in Pharaoh's mind, yeah, there's many gods. Okay, that's fine. But, you know, your God, you're slaves. You've been our slaves for 400 years. What kind of God is that I should be paying attention to? I don't know that God, and I don't care to know that God, and that God has nothing on me. So I'm not going to obey that God because I'm a God myself. So why should I pay any attention to what you're saying? I don't know this God, and I don't want to know this God, I think is also what he's saying. And that God has no authority over me. So I say no. And actually, of course, the Lord, Yud He Vav He, the one who was and is to come, the great I am, is not just some, you know, petty tribal deity of, you know, slaves. He is the maker of heaven and earth. He is Lord of all. He is the God of gods, you know, as Israel sings, "Who is like unto you, O Lord, among the gods," right? When that's the end of the story after Pharaoh's armies are drowned in the Red Sea. They sing that song, "Who is like unto you?" And of course, the answer is no one is like the Lord. There is no spiritual entity like the maker of heaven and earth. None compares to him. But Pharaoh, in his arrogance, doesn't know that, but he's about to find out. And that's sort of another two-sided coin, and maybe we should say dual-edged sword of the Exodus. And I think this also relates to Aliyah. I think I need to be very careful when I explain this, but on the one hand, God's deliverance of the Jewish people is salvation, freedom from bondage, embracing a people who had no status to make them sons and daughters of the living God. It's all very, very beautiful. We talked about this last time. We read in Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, the 4 promises that God made to the Jewish people about their deliverance and their redemption and their freedom and taking them to be his own. But the other side of this sword is a sword of judgment. And the deliverance and the freedom of the Jewish people also meant judgment on Egypt. And a display, of course, to the Jewish people, to Israel, who their God is, right? When they're at the Red Sea, Moses says, "Don't be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of your God." And God displays his wonders. And that really would have been quite the amazing sight for Israel to see the power of the God of Israel, but at the same time, that display of power and that salvation for Israel as they went through the sea on dry land was also judgment on Egypt, because the sea then covers over Pharaoh's army. And we have, as the, integral part of this story of the Exodus, the display of God's power through signs and wonders that bring deliverance and also bring judgment. And Pharaoh says, "I don't know this Lord," and he's about to find out. So let's look again at the scriptures. "I do not know the Lord. Who is he? Why should I obey his voice? And moreover, I will not let Israel go." And this is what God says: "I will harden Pharaoh's heart." Now, if you follow the story, at first Pharaoh is obstinate, but as he continues in his stubbornness, we read that actually God then confirms him in the stubbornness that he first demonstrates himself, okay? And God hardens Pharaoh's heart for his own purposes. "And though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my armies, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. And the Egyptians," which of course includes Pharaoh, "shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them." Okay, I just want to make the point that God's deliverance for the Jewish people and God's return, because this is the first Aliyah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Jacob's sons and their families are in Canaan. They leave and go to Egypt, and then they return. Of course, there's a big 400-year gap there, but they return. It is a return and the first. And it, as the first return, demonstrates a pattern that follows. And one of these aspects of this pattern is that God's return of the Jewish people back to the land demonstrates to the nations that he is the Lord. And by the way, and I think as we're going to see this as we follow through this, even as we see it in the Exodus, I would say that the witness to the world is perhaps even more important in God's purposes than his purposes for the children of Israel. Now let that sink into your spirit for a moment. That usually when we think about these things, we think about, God's faithfulness and goodness to Israel. And of course it is. But also, and this is the whole point of this message, it is a witness to the nations who do not know who is the Lord. What God does for Israel is a clear witness to the nations, even to this day. If we just pause and think about the miracle that is modern Israel, the incredible odds the nation has overcome, the incredible miraculous victories the nation has won when foes have come against them over and over and over again. If you have eyes to see and ears to hear, it is a witness that is screaming loud and clear to the world that the God of Israel is the maker of heaven and earth. It is a profound witness to the world. And really, I think God chose this one small nation so that not only, there's many purposes. God is a multitasker, but I think the huge part of this and the whole mystery of Israel and the purposes that God's choosing Israel is not so much about Israel at all, but to bear witness to all people, the nations of the world, that he is the maker of heaven and earth. All right, so he says, I'm going to bring you out with great signs and wonders and with judgments, and then the Egyptians will know. But they're not the only ones. Let's share our screen again. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. Now these plagues, these 10 plagues that come against Egypt, demonstrate on the one hand to Israel that their God is going to bring deliverance to them. Remember, the plague is happening among the Egyptians, but in the houses of the children of Israel, the plagues are not happening. But it's not just on the people and nation of Israel that these plagues are coming. These plagues also correspond to judgments on the gods of Egypt. And we don't really have time to go into every single one of these plagues and show how they correspond to the gods of Egypt. But if you search this out, you'll see that every one of these plagues relates to the power of the gods of Egypt as well. For instance, I'll just give you one, turning the Nile to blood. Now, the Nile was considered a deity. Even in Roman times, the Nile is considered a god. And if you go to Tzipori in Israel and you look at a very beautiful Roman mosaic of the Nile River, you see the Nile is personified as a woman. And she is the one who is providing the water for the Nile that, is used to water to irrigate all the crops, and is worshipped even into Roman times. But turning the water, the life-giving, sustaining water of the Nile into blood is an indictment against the gods of Egypt, that the Nile is not a god. There is one God who made the Nile and every other river and every other thing on planet Earth, the maker of heaven and earth, who is the God of Israel. And of course, as I'd mentioned earlier, Pharaoh is a god. And Pharaoh's firstborn son, who would be his heir, would also be considered a god. And when all the firstborn of Egypt are killed, that is an indictment against the gods of Egypt. Pharaoh is not a god. He is a man. His son is not a god. He is also a man. So all of these plagues not only bring deliverance for the children of Israel, but they are a witness to Egypt and also the nations, because the nations hear about what God has done, and an indictment against the gods of Egypt. And it's always this way. And even today, we might not worship rivers and mountains and the sun and the moon and the stars, but there is much idolatry. And really, I think who we worship today is we worship ourselves. Just like Pharaoh was a god, we all consider ourselves to be gods, in a sense, in our modern world. And we don't, I'm talking about with a very broad brush, humanity in general, don't really take to heart that the God of Israel is the maker of heaven and earth, and the one to whom we owe everything, even the breath in our lungs, and him only shall we serve. And what God is doing even in Israel today is an indictment against the gods of this world, and certainly the prince of the power of the air, the enemy. It is all accomplishing God's purposes to bear witness to the truth and bring judgment to those who oppose him. And we see this in this Exodus story. Remember what God said to Abraham. He said, and after, I will judge that nation who, held you in bondage. And this is a principle as well that we see throughout the scriptures. So I'm going to show you, and we're going to talk about this quite a bit more later. We're not there yet, but we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the blessings and the curses found in Leviticus, and then later in Deuteronomy, and the restoration promises also found in these two books of the Torah. But I just want to highlight one part of the restoration, and we see it in the Exodus, is this judgment on those who persecute Israel. And the Lord your God will put all these curses on your foes. So remember earlier in Deuteronomy, God gives a great long list of curses for Israel's disobedience. But then in this restoration passage in Deuteronomy 30, he says that all these curses, that is the curses of Deuteronomy 28, he will put on Israel's foes and enemies who persecuted Israel. And we see that in the Exodus story as well. And we see that with when God used Assyria, but then God judged Assyria. We see this with Babylon, and it's just part of the pattern. Of course, you know, going back to Abraham, the one who blesses you, I will bless, and he who curses you, I will curse. That's part of this dynamic. But it's not just revenge, or there's nothing petty at all about it. It is bearing witness to the maker of heaven and earth. And this witness is primarily to the nations. And I want to show you, we're going to just end with two more scriptural references, which I think are very profound, that demonstrate the significance of Aliyah as it relates to as a witness to the nations. Yes, of course, it's to the benefit of Israel, but I think in an even broader sense, the importance is to bear witness to the nations. And we'll see as we continue on in this series, the importance of that, the significance of that, how this all connects to the return of the Lord, to Jerusalem, and how this is so significant for God's purposes to bring restoration, not just for Israel, but for all humanity. That's the ultimate goal. God of Israel is also the maker of heaven and earth, the creator of the world, and the God of all. So let's just go a little bit forward in the story. After these great signs and wonders, Israel is delivered, and then there's this incredible miraculous deliverance at the Red Sea. And then there is the wilderness, and things don't go exactly wonderfully in the wilderness for Israel. They have many trials and tribulations. Some of them, as the Lord said, I tested you, but some of them, or probably most of them, they brought on themselves by their stubbornness, by their disobedience, because they needed to learn who the Lord was too. As many people like to say, it's one thing to bring Israel out of Egypt, it's another thing to take Egypt out of Israel, and I think we all can relate to this. But you know what happened when Moses is on the top of the mountain, receiving the revelation and the law of God, the covenant. The people say to Aaron, make us a god, because as for this Moses, we don't know what's happened to him. He'd been gone 40 days, and they want an idol, something that they could see with their eyes to represent their God, even though they had heard the audible voice of God saying, you must never do this. So it's it's a staggering act of rebellion, disobedience, and unbelief. And when Moses comes down the mountain, and there are all these children of Israel dancing and cavorting around this golden calf, there comes a time when God says, stand aside, Moses, and I'm going to bring judgment on these people and start over with you. Now, he had every right to do that, but Moses intercedes on behalf of the people. And it's very interesting what Moses says. So let's take a look at the scriptures once again. You'd expect him to say, "Have mercy on your people, O Lord. Remember your covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." That's not what he says. Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand?" Now get this. "Why should the Egyptians say, 'With evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people.'" Moses' argument is not the covenant God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not you are a God of compassion and mercy and faithfulness. Moses' intercession and his appeal to the Lord is on the basis of what would the nations, what would Egypt think if you did this thing? I think that's amazing. The appeal to heaven is not for the sake of Israel. The appeal to heaven is for the sake of the nations, for Egypt, that if you do this thing, then the Egyptians will get the wrong idea about who you are. And of course, we're going to get this eventually taken up again in Ezekiel chapter 36, how important that God's name is to be sanctified among the nations. And if God were to judge Israel, it would bring God's reputation into disrepute. And this is Moses' appeal to stay the Lord's hand from judgment. I think that's amazing. But you know what happened. God was merciful to them, and he, some were judged, but essentially the nation was preserved. And they're continuing with their struggles and their difficulties in the wilderness. And then finally it's time for them to go into the land that God promised them. But first they send out 12 spies who come back. You know the story. 10 of the spies say, "Yeah, everything God said about the land is true, but there's no way we can take this land because there are giants there and they live in fortified cities and they're much more numerous than us. We cannot take this land." And only Joshua and Caleb give a good report saying, "Yes, we can. If the Lord delights in us, we can certainly do this." But the people don't believe Joshua and Caleb. They believe the majority opinion of the 12 spies, the 10 who said no. And they, look at Moses and say, "Why did you bring us out here? Let's appoint a new leader to take us back to Egypt. Instead of, having our little ones taken as captives and all of us killed, let's go back at least, to the security of what we know in Egypt." And just like what happened at the incident of the golden calf, God says, "Stand aside, and I am going to destroy this people and start over again with you, Moses." And what does Moses do? He intercedes, of course, for the people. Let's look at Moses' intercession after the people said, "No, we won't go in to take the land. We're going to appoint a new leader to look after us and take us back to Egypt." And when God said, "I'm going to destroy these people," Moses said to the Lord, "Well, then the Egyptians will hear of it, For you brought this people in your might from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land, they have heard that you, O Lord, are in the midst of this people. For you, O Lord, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands over them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and in a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill this people as one man, then the nations who have heard of your fame will say, it is because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land that he swore to them, that he has killed them in the wilderness. Again, Moses' intercession, his appeal to heaven to spare Israel, is not for Israel's sake. Isn't that amazing? We see this, in these two major times of intercession for Israel, the two most significant intercessions in the wilderness. The appeal is not, have mercy on your people, remember your covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's, but what will the Egyptians think? What will the nations who have heard of your fame think? What impression will they get of you, the maker of heaven and earth, if you destroy Israel and bring judgment upon them? Therefore, spare your people. I think this is amazing. And it's a very, very significant to see how all of God's purposes for Israel are not only for Israel, but also to demonstrate to the world, to all the nations, to all humanity, that he is the maker of heaven and earth. And this pattern continues. It's not just with the Exodus, but as we look through the scriptures and even consider the prophetic word of the return of the Lord, of course, he's returning to Jerusalem. Always the mercy that is extended to Israel and the salvation that comes to Israel is the fulfillment of his covenant promise to the nation and his witness to all the nations of the world. And that which brings salvation to Israel also brings judgment on those who oppose the God of Israel. As I said, God is a multitasker, and Aliyah is not just about Israel, but about the nations and ultimately the redemption of humanity. All right, so that's the Exodus, and it's just a pattern for us that we see repeated over again in the later return of Israel back to the land, and the prophetic promise of Israel's return and restoration, and the promise of the Lord's return at the very end of the age. Okay, so we're going to start looking next time at God's requirements for his people in the covenant he made with the nation at Sinai, and see how this relates to Aliyah. So until then, the Lord bless you, and thanks so much for your attention. See you next time.